Good afternoon. We are resuming our lecture on Six Sigma, and the session that we have going now, it's the second lecture in the series on benchmarking. In this particular session, we'll be discussing how to benchmark. Something that I've got to remind you of is, remember the last slide that I had in the previous lecture on benchmarking, that was basically a summary of various things. I said keep it simple, be willing to give what you get, respect confidentiality, respect the source of information, keep information internal, use benchmarking contacts, and don't refer to the material that you've acquired without permission with any other place, any other people. Be prepared at the initial contact. These were the kind of things that you got to keep in mind. Now I'm going to be expanding on a couple of these things in the next couple of slides. The first and foremost, of course, is the etiquette and ethics. These are going to be very, very important. And how are they important? When you're benchmarking with competition, establish a specific ground rule right up front. Make sure you agree upon how you're going to be interacting. This is something you got to establish right up front. For example, you'll say, I don't want to talk about things that will give either of us a competitive advantage. Rather, we want to share materials where we can both mutually improve or gain some benefit. That's what we'd like you to do. So we do not really want to draw competitive advantage out of each other. That's not something that we are here for. We are here for sharing. We are here for sharing and learning. And hopefully the benefits are going to be mutual. And do not ask competitors for sensitive data. That's also something that you should avoid. This is not ethical. And in fact, it turns out that if possible, you might use a third party to acquire this data for you, competitive data, blind competitive data. And of course, if in such a case, sometimes you need such information, you should really obtain legal counsel before you go into this, because you should not do anything that's not legal. You do everything that is permitted within the realm of legal requirements and so on, and that is all right. But please do not do anything that's going to be unethical or illegal. Consult with the legal counsel if there is going to be any information gathering procedure that's in doubt, that where you've got some doubt, before you contact any direct competition. And this is like something that you got to be able to do. Go through your legal channel. Any information that you obtain from a benchmarking partner, it should be treated as internal and privileged information, and that you must not share with anyone. Do not really put someone down. This is like something that you should never do. Attempt to limit competition or gain business through benchmarking relationship. Try to see if you could avoid doing this. Because if you do that, you will not get further cooperation. That's like something that you should not be able to, they should try to avoid. Misrepresenting oneself just to get information, that's also not ethical. This is again something that you should not be able to do. When you are in a face-to-face site visit situation, there are certain things that you should really do. Provide the meeting agenda well in advance. Let people know why you are going there. Be professional, be honest, be courteous, and be prompt. Of course, show up on time. Introduce all the attendees and explain why they are there. That's like something that's also required. Stick to the agenda and maintain focus on benchmarking issues only. Do not wander off. That's something you should try to avoid. Use language that is universal, and do not get into jargons, because that makes the communication part kind of difficult. And do not share proprietary information without prior approval from your bosses, and of course from anyone who seems to have the right authority. That you should not do. And this applies to both the parties. Share information about your process if asked, and make sure that it is at a level when it is required for benchmarking, but certainly nothing more than that. And offer to set up a reciprocal visit. Make sure that those companies, they are also allowed to come back and see your process. Conclude the meetings and of course visits also on schedule. And thank the partner for the time they have given and for the sharing that they have done. Let me give you an example. There was a company that, again, I go back to the example where they made those electronic parts, and they had a wave soldering machine that they were not able to operate. And they struggled pretty hard for about a year, and they could not reduce the level of defect that they were getting out of this new technology, so-called new technology. And they were really at a loss. They were even thinking of selling the machine off or returning to the supplier at a cut price or whatever. Those things they were considering. They thought they should go back to their manual system of soldering those the electronic parts on their PCBs. What happened was I was able to locate another enterprise in a different line of business, but that also used wedge soldering. So here the situation turned out to be quite straightforward. There was no competition really between company A and company B. Company B was the other factory that I located, and they were using the same technology, but the products were entirely different. These guys made electronic parts for motorcycles, and the other guys, they made telephone sets. So in fact, the business was totally disjoint. There was no real issue there. The visit took place, and of course, a lot of notes were taken and so on and so forth, and no photographs, but a lot of notes were taken, a lot of questions were asked and so on and so forth. Those things took place. Then debriefing was done in the evening. And of course, there was this offer of made by the company that came in, that the visitors, they made an offer to the people who were the hosts. Please come back, please come to our town, and please look at our processes. We've got some other processes. They are certainly better than the process that we are trying to benchmark, and you might like to see some neat things there. So that offer was also made, and it turned out to be a case when there was a longer term relationship that evolved through this. They were able to identify, for example, suppliers that provided these solders. The solders were eventually melted, and they were kind of used in that solder bath in the wedge soldering machine. They located the visiting company were able to find some good suppliers by the contact that they had with the host company. So that was something that was a real plus for them. So it is something where you really end up with a gain. Lessons from active benchmarkers. They are the people who do a lot of benchmarking. What do they gain? What do they cite? Something they try to avoid doing is benchmarking everything. That is something that they do not try to do. I mean, it's not necessary for you unless the marketplace is such that you are really way behind in everything. Please do not try to benchmark everything. That's not just necessary, because benchmarking consumes a lot of resource. Something you should also try to do, try to seek the best in class for your core processes, not for everything, but for your core processes, because certainly the best in class people, they probably have a lower cost production, lower cost process. This is something you should try to actively seek out. And also, from time to time, try to look for internal, regional, or industry benchmarks, not necessarily global benchmarks. Because there are perhaps other people who are in your line of business, or they operate processes like yours. They're not far from you, but their level of performance is far better than where you are. So why not take advantage of it? You don't really have to go out to a Japanese auto plant. You could go to your neighbor's plant, go to a town that is probably 500 kilometers away, and you'd probably pick up some good practices there instead of having to visit Japan. So this is something you could probably do, and you should try to do this. These are the lessons that are drawn from people that are provided by people who are active benchmarkers. Also now, there is a shift now from treating financial figures only as the foundation for success. Performance measurement has now expanded. So you do not just benchmark financial performance, you look at other aspects also. And I'm going to give you a glimpse of that. Here's a case study, and this case study is about a hospital. And this hospital, of course, in the end, they all wanted to make money, but they were benchmarking different things. They're trying to benchmark certain practices. And I'm going to give you an idea of what kind of things they were trying to benchmark. The hospital is Greenwich Hospital, and they belong to a particular company, that is the integrated healthcare company. And they had their problems and so on. And they wanted to improve. They wanted to become more profitable. They wanted to utilize their specialists better, and so on and so forth. So a lot of places were there where they had a sense that perhaps things could be done better. But they decided that they would do benchmarking. Instead of trying to do a little bit of Kaizen here and there, or get into a fancy Six Sigma program, they would just try to benchmark their process. At least they wanted to make sure they understood the gap. They understood the gap that was there between themselves and the best in town. So the first thing they did was they identified the mission. They assessed their own practice and they measured the performance there. So they utilized certain self-assessment tools and they aimed at benchmarking the key indicators of performance. This came from their own management objectives. Then, of course, this was something where you could use a balanced scorecard or any other measure of success that you have in your company that you could do. And they also thought of collaborating to leverage resources. They wanted to make sure that they gave some and perhaps the partner would give some, and in the end they would end up with a better process overall. And they wanted to quantify the opportunities. This is something where they wanted to make sure that they quantified certain opportunities. Now, if you go back to benchmarking, if you recall benchmarking, various places where people try to benchmark are these productivity. They try to benchmark themselves, their own productivity with that of competition or that of best in town or the best in industry, or perhaps even globally. They would like to do that. A lot of people do that. Whoever are people who are involving, they are utilizing manpower or capital resources or equipment and so on, or land and so on. They always try to look for productivity. What is the output per unit, whatever input? Many people, they also like to measure their revenue. I think that's probably a very, very common sort of thing. Most people, they have some measure of revenue. That's like a trust. Not many people really have a very good understanding of their costs. So this is also something that they would like to be able to do this. And if you're doing benchmarking, it's a great idea to put in measurement devices or measurement means or instruments to take care of these things. And of course, today, lo and behold, quality has also appeared here on this benchmarking list. So that's also something that you'd like to benchmark. And that, of course, goes without saying, because this mission of Six Sigma is to try to raise your quality. So there, the benchmarks are clearly the guys who've got 4 Sigma or 5 Sigma or 6 Sigma operation today itself. And you might be stuck at 3 Sigma. So there's a big chance to do your quality benchmarking. What I'd like to be able to do is I'd like to be able to use standards and objective measures. Both of these things I'd like to be able to do. For this company, they wanted to make sure they improved their profitability, and they had these different indicators. And let's go through these indicators one by one. Indicators of probability, what they could measure was hours per week, and I'm going to give you an example of this. Patient visits per hour. They wanted to measure this. Revenue per physician, because this was a hospital, they wanted to measure this. And surgeries performed per week, they wanted to measure these. These were, in their mind, indicators of productivity. They wanted to make sure they measured this, or they would like to benchmark this. Accounts receivable. You know, if there's a lot of money that is tied up in the receivables, you are really not making any interest money on that. And that money, if it is with you, you'd be, putting it back in your business. You'd be probably adding that to your working capital, for example. And even that you're not able to do if your AR, the account receivable, that account is huge. That's also something these people wanted to measure. So they had some good, smart people who could see not only their direct per hour productivity kind of thing, they also wanted to get a financial picture of the thing. They also wanted to get an idea of their expenses. So staffing levels, for example, they wanted to get an idea how were they staffed as compared to other people in the same line of business. They also wanted to get a sense of the overhead they were consuming in providing their service. This was a hospital. So a large body of manpower in this hospital. They were really not doctors. They were not really surgeons and so on. They were like overhead. They were the assistance people and cleaning people and so on and so forth. And perhaps people who brought material in and out and that kind of thing. They were really not doing patient care. So people who are doing patient care, they were of course rather few, and they're the specialists. But even these people, they cost some money. Overhead also costs a lot of money. So they wanted to do some benchmarking there. And of course, the quality of management they had, the kind of governance they had. They also wanted to make sure that the decision-making process also was something that they could compare to the better ones. For example, if a new doctor had to be hired, what was the procedure? They wanted to benchmark that process to the best in town, for example. That they also wanted to do. So these were the keys to their aspects of their business that they would like to benchmark. Here's the first example. I only have a couple of them. This is of course a large case study that documents a lot of this stuff. And the office hours per week, it turns out that the American Medical Association, it shows a much higher level of number of hours spent by the doctors in their offices. The average is high up there. And these are the different doctors, Dr. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Out of them, except 2 doctors, which is like Dr. A and Dr. C, all the others, they are below the national average. This is a direct example of benchmarking. This is an absolute direct example of benchmarking. Now, this is something you've now picked this up. You've got your own measurement done, you've got the tally done and so on, and you produce this thing. And obviously, the follow-up would be for the hospital administrator, the chief, to do a little follow-up, perhaps find out why Dr. D and Dr. G, why they are not in the office as much. Do they live very far away, or do they have other business that is going on, and so on and so forth? What exactly is the issue there? Because the more they are in the office, the more treatment there would be, more patients they'd be looking at, and the more revenue there would be. In fact, the revenue opportunity turned out to be $241,500. That is the annual revenue opportunity. That would be the difference between what the AMA averages and what these doctors were bringing into this hospital. This is a direct example of benchmarking. And here's the quantification, of course. I mentioned quantification couple of slides back. And here the AMA, the American Medical Association mean hours per week, 30 times 7 physicians, that turns out to be so much. That would be like your, absolute benchmark. Then you've got less the total actual practice hours. This is from the hospital, from Greenwich. The difference between these two is the hours per week. That's the extra that could be there. And of course, when you translate all of that into this money, this is the lost revenue. In that red circle there, that's the lost revenue. That also could be yours, provided you work those hours, you work those extra hours. Here's another example. And this is the accounts receivable. Remember, I was mentioning the accounts receivable, which is like when you basically provide a patient treatment. She goes away and she promises to give you this money. You send her a bill that sets up a receivable. She owes you this money. Now, how long does she take to pay that money back? And it turns out that if you look at the aging, these have been done in days. 0 to 30 days, about a third of the people, they paid up within 30 days. Within 2 months, 12% people. Within 3 months, 4% people. Within 4 months, 4% of people. And my God, there were people. Half of the people didn't pay within what we call 4 months. They didn't pay. And you were losing interest on this money. And perhaps there were other uses you could put this money to, but you did not have this. Compare that to the national average. This is the national average. More than half paid within 1 month. And here, more than half they were paying after 4 months. So there is like a clear difference between these two, and that's your benchmark. That's the very reason why you did your benchmarking. This is almost 20% below this number there, and this number is way more. It's 4 times more, 3 to 4 times more than what the national average is. So this is now a direct example again of benchmarking. What has this done to you? It has highlighted a problem. It has also quantified the extent of that problem there. And this is your hospital. This is Greenwich. Obviously, what you'd like to be able to do is do problem diagnosis, do problem analysis. Now, if you're doing DMAC, define, measure, analyze, then improve, and then control. Right at the analyze phase itself, you've caught this. You've done some benchmarking, and you've caught the culprit there. You'd like to do some problem solving there. You'd like to do some diagnosis. You'd like to do some troubleshooting, and hopefully come up with procedures or processes that would take care of this. Perhaps you'd like to provide some incentives for people to pay on time, but again, try to find out the practices for billing and collection as it is practiced by the more successful hospitals. How are they doing it? That's like another area where you could do very easily. You could do benchmarking. That's something you should try to do. If I do this case study, if I follow up this case study, the losses due to the aging of the accounts receivable, that turns out to be, in this case, $55,000. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money when you look at, this is per patient, and that's a lot of money. And it turns out that the interest on this lost is a lot of money there. And this is again, that gets established only as the result of the benchmarking that is done here. If you look at, for example, the dashboard for benchmarking performance measures, what you'd like to be able to do is, you'd like to set up these, this sort of dashboard in front of you. And you've got, they have two aspects here. They've got profitability and quality. And notice here, there's a bit of blue in the yellow circles, and there's a little bit of yellow in the blue circles, blue or the green circles as they appear here. In fact, it turns out profitability, the indications there, the indications of profitability are cash flow, how you're servicing your debt, costs, capital expenditures, liabilities, assets, and sales. These are impacted by profitability. Quality, they of course, those are impacted by all these drivers. These are the drivers of quality. I've got cycle time, training, referrals, defect rates, customer satisfaction, employee retention, so on and so forth. So these are the ones that I could really examine if I'm trying to improve quality. So if this dashboard is in front of me, I could watch the needles here, and then depending on the position of these needles, I could go out and start watching these dials or these dials, for example. This is something that's going to be very helpful. So in fact, this one dashboard, it provides me a very compact view of the total business. There are other detailed measures of performance. These are also utilized in benchmarking. For example, in accounting, they look at percentage rate of late payments, time to respond to customer requests, number of billing errors, number of payroll errors. These can easily be set up as benchmarks, and you could do benchmarking based on this. Marketing, for example, the accuracy of forecast assumptions, number of incorrect order entries, overstock, field supplies, contact errors, and stuff like that. If you look at quality control, the kind of stuff that you could benchmark against are percentage of lots that are rejected in error, not because they are bad, but something went wrong in the inspection process itself. Number of engineering changes detected after design review. Design review was done. Even after that, there were a whole lot of engineering changes. That's something that can impact quality. So you'd like to probably monitor this. Errors in reports and the time taken to provide a corrective action. That's also something that actually can be benchmarked quite easily. I have the same sort of thing for purchasing. I've got the same thing for product engineering and information services. Take a look at these details there. I left it for you. Any of these things can be benchmarked. This is something that one could easily benchmark against. In the domain of human resource management, you probably would like to track employee performance, and what you'd like to be able to do is, besides just the rating given by the supervisor, these are the other things that one could also benchmark against. For example, many times companies these days, they are measuring the number of, they're keeping a tab on the number of hours a person is sent out for training. It used to be not too long ago, but training was considered to be something that was really not necessary. People would learn on the job. In fact, not many companies even now provide extensive training. The problem is, of course, these people, they are not completely trained, so they make mistakes, or they commit errors, or they commit sometimes even blunders or big problems, or they have safety problems and stuff like that. To try to take care of that, you've got to again keep an eye on these things and set this up on charts and try to find out what about those companies. Those are established companies and they are treated to be successful companies. How are they doing? Benchmark your performance against theirs. Also, you'd like to probably keep an eye on education. What kind of recognitions you are providing? How often are people absent? How I'm treating the grievances? What is their number? How are people involved in the affairs of the company? And of course, the performance appraisal. That's like something I mean, it's very possible to set up benchmarking systems around these. That's something you'd like to be able to do. Technology and innovation, this is like another area where you could do benchmarking. For example, processing speeds, uh, network downtime and error rates in a company that is using IT, product development times, employee suggestion rates, new product sales as percent of total sales, for example, process improvement rates. These are again activities that can be benchmarked because everybody else is also involved in the same sort of thing. And if you're really going to be comparing to best in town, you better make sure that you're also there with them. Whoever are the better performers, you'll be there right with them. This is also something that you'd like to be able to do. Supplier performance measure. This is also something where you could do benchmarking quite easily. Cost, quality, reliability, speed of responsiveness, agreed upon service levels, and product specs. These again are aspects that can be quite easily benchmarked. And if you've got several different suppliers, it's not going to be difficult to get a chart going on any of these things. What I personally found is the moment you start collecting data and start plotting a chart, benchmarking kind of almost becomes, an internal process. People start watching these curves and trends and so on and so forth. If something is out of whack, even without the proper SPC control limits, if something looks high and high is not desirable, then they take some action. All I'm doing here is I'm providing a comparison. And that's exactly what benchmarking does. It compares you to someone who's better than you. And it lets you ask the questions, how are you there? What have you done? What do you do differently from the way I do it? And this you discover by doing the detailed questioning. Once you've done the detailed questioning, of course, a lot of things would come out. And this is exactly what you're out there in the benchmarking situation to discover. Once you come back, do your debriefing, make some notes, and put them in your own training, in your own operations, and so on. And the result is going to be hopefully better products, better quality, and superior quality performance for your customers and your own system there. That's something you'd like to be able to do. Cost performance measures, there again are many different things. We got to make sure we have a pretty decent understanding of our costs. And there are many ratios that also are there. And one can again do benchmark against those ratios there. For example, these could be tied to products or certain services or certain organizational units, and one could compare them one to the other. For example, the kilowatt hour spent per square foot area of the factory, for example, and try to find out if there are some that are not turning off the lights and fans and so on when the plant is not operating and stuff like that. And they are invariably going to show up the moment benchmarking is done. And this is something that is all internal. It's not something that for which you have to go out and so on. Of course, if you could go out, please make sure you find out what are the best companies doing, what are the better companies doing, and particularly the ones that are more profitable and that have got a positive sort of a brand in the minds of the customers. How do they operate? What are their practices? That is something you'd like to be able to do. There's a mortgage company, for example, when they started measuring their costs, they started benchmarking, for example, the cost per loan application. When you produce a loan application, you provide a certain amount of data. Then the company does a lot of checking. They might call up Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and so on, and they may call up some credit rating companies and so on. And this process takes time. There are efficient ways for doing this, and there are not so efficient ways of doing this. If this is done by people who are experienced, they can, with a few questions, they can probably get the answer. If people are not experienced in doing this kind of work, make sure they get trained. But again, benchmark their performance, just so that you establish a case for this change there. Data processing cost per 100 bills. If you're in the mortgage business, for example, you're probably sending out these different notices and so on. What is your cost as compared to somebody else? Is there a lot of paper folding involved? Is there a lot of licking and stamping involved, or is it an automatic machine? Try to find out what is the service cost per loan. Loans also require certain services. And what is your cost? What is that service cost there? And how does it compare to the best in town again? Best in town is the guy who can be treated as your benchmark. Try to do this comparison there. This is also something that you should be able to do. Financial performance, perhaps this is the most common one. And this is so because we are talking about revenue, we are talking about gross profit, we are talking about operating income, we are talking about net income, we are talking about earnings per share, we are talking about long-term debt, we are talking about book value of the company, we are talking about cash flow picture, and these different ratios, for example, debt to equity ratio and days to receivable ratio, current ratio, and so on and so forth. Any of these things can be benchmarked. In fact, the investment banking people, they track a lot of these things. And of course, this could be done by the company internally. They're accounting people, they probably can do this. And they can find out why is it that a particular company seems to have a better situation, better position than we. What is the difference? How are they different from us? In what way are they different from us? This is something that is that may be very revealing. In fact, it turns out only when you've started asking some questions, done some calculations, drawn a few graphs, the problem jumps out. The problem kind of says that you've not been paying attention. But I've been bleeding. I've been bleeding from the side, and it's behind me, so I don't even notice that there is some bleeding going on. I have a little scratch, and I scratched it bad, and now my pant is wet, and that sort of thing. This is something that I'd like to be able to avoid, and that's why periodically I must do benchmarking. I must find out how life is going on in other places, and I'd like to be able to get up there. What are some of the critical success factors in benchmarking? I've been talking about the process of benchmarking. What are those things which are good practices or perhaps close to the best practices? I mentioned to you adopt, adapt, and advance. Certain things are required besides if you want to be successful in benchmarking. And like in total quality management, you got to have involvement of the top management, of top managers. Their thinking should be in sync with your thinking, or your thinking should be in sync with them. And if benchmark is important for your company, you should be able to sell this idea to top management. You should be able to do that. By establishing some cases, you should be able to do that. Once you are able to do that, hopefully you will get the kind of support that you require to be able to do benchmarking. Benchmarking costs resources, benchmark costs money, benchmarking costs time. It's not going to be free. It's not that you walk by the place, you drive by the other company and you kind of stop and at the gate and you say hello to your pal and you ask some questions. Benchmarking is far deeper than that. That's why it would require you to spend some time. It would require you to do some, planning and so on and so forth. It would require some additional resources. Perhaps an experts in a company would be involved in this and so on and so forth. So this is kind of important. It's kind of important that you acquire and you secure top management support. Very important. Then benchmark as a process, there are a lot of measurements involved, a lot of very tricky measurements involved, questioning involved and so on and so forth. And you might know that this is also something that is a specialized area. And you might need some training in this area. If you want to do benchmarking successfully, you might do this formally and you might require some special skills. Any of these things are really launched as a project. A benchmarking undertaking is really launched as a project. What does the project comprise? It is a charter. It spells out the scope. It then identifies the major deliverables. And then it looks at the tasks required to perform in order to deliver those different deliverables which are there. That also has to be done. These tasks have to be sequenced. They have to be planned in the order in which they should appear. They have to be resourced. Then, of course, you hand this over to the benchmarking team. They start executing. While execution is going on, this is just like you're managing a project, no less than managing a real formal project. So you'll have a timeline. You'll have resource requirements at various points in time. You'll have to spend some money, do some transportation and so on, do some travel. Then, of course, in the process, while you're doing benchmarking, you're asking questions, meeting with people and so on. So you're expending some resources. That also is going on. You're acquiring information, so you're making some notes. You're slowly building up your benchmarking literature. You're doing your meetings. You're recognizing the differences. In the end, you come up with probably a piece of document that says, these are the places where we are different from the other guys. We are actually worse than the other guys. Those then become the action plan for the I step. I is In the DMAC, define, I started with D, measure, analyze, improve and control. I've got to walk the full 5 steps. Unless I've done that, of course, improvement won't be there. In the IF step, in the step that starts with I, which is improve, I really utilize the benchmark as my target. I utilize that as my target. I establish what the gap is. This has been done at the analysis step, the A step. And then I've got my gap identified. And I get into this now. I get into the problem solving mode and I come up with different solutions there. That takes place as an activity that is distinct from benchmarking. So benchmarking, please make no mistakes. Benchmarking basically establishes where you are. Now, how do you compare to the best in town? And have you seen one? Have you found out what they do? You go that far with benchmarking. The actual changes take place in the phase when you get into really changing your thing, and that is the time when you might be doing some improvement also. And that really follows the first part, which is like collection of data, identifying the gap, and then thinking through the steps that would be required. That would be required for you to go from one end to the other, and make sure you also are at a step that is near the benchmark. You are also at a stage that is near the benchmark that you would like to be able to do. Technology systems, information technology systems, those are also like required in benchmarking. So you cannot really do without this. And perhaps some statistical software might be required. Of course, you could also do a lot of work with Excel, but at least you should have those tools in place if you want to do proper benchmarking, you want to have data support and so on and so forth. The cultural orientation should be that of learning. That also goes without failing. You may have all these different things. I've got 5 pillars here. And resource dedication, that also is something that is required. So I've got senior management support. That's something very critical. I have some benchmarking training involved, and I've got use of information technology. That is something that I've got there. And I have the learning orientation, learning attitude, and of course I get some resources. These are required. These are the critical success factors in benchmarking. Without these being in place, it's not really easy, not even possible sometimes, to do your benchmarking. Let's now walk through some of the processes. Let's now walk through some of the processes which are good practices, and they are used by leading companies in the world. Bristol Myers and Baxter International, they are like one, and they use a 7-step benchmarking process. And you'll find that they've got the same, pretty well the same themes that we've been discussing so far in this last 1.5 hours. What we've been doing is we've been discussing various aspects of the same steps. For example, determine which function to benchmark. Well, we heard about that. Identify key performance variables to measure. Of course, we also heard about that. Identify the best in class. Like we had to find out who are the best in class. Was that a global benchmark? Was it a national? Was it an industry-wide benchmark? Or was it a local internal benchmark? Whatever it was, I've got to really make sure I identify that. And I sort of say, here's a benchmark that is the best. Here's a process that is better than my process. So it could serve as my benchmark. Then, of course, I measure performance of the best-in-class companies. For this, I have to get out there and I have to really do this benchmarking process. This is like some process that these guys use. Then, of course, Bristol Myers, they also measure their own performance, and this is how they establish the gap. The gap is established after they measured the process or the performance at the benchmarking site and their own process. This is the gap that they try to identify. And then they go ahead and they specify programs and action. Now comes the correction step or the improvement step to meet and surpass the benchmark that they have seen there. And then they implement the new processes and they monitor the results. This is almost like doing our DMAC, except we did not do design of experiments. We did not do that. Notice here, the improvement step here is somewhat qualitative, but if necessary, if need be there, then you could do DOE at the improvement step there. Because you identify the gap, you've identified the gap, and you know exactly that this gap has to be narrowed. And you might like to identify the causes for it. So you go back to your old fishbone diagram and the orthogonal matrix and all those things if you want to. If they are needed, then of course you do those things. But the task of benchmarking is to identify the gap that is there between the best in town, and I keep calling them the best in town, because they could be the best in industry or they could be globally best. Whatever they are better than us, and we are here, and this is the gap that we'd like to make up. This is exactly what benchmarking is doing. So this was Bristol Myers. Let's see what some of the other people are doing. Motorola uses a 5-step benchmarking process. They decide what to benchmark, like what we did before. Find companies to benchmark. This also is something that we've done before. We've seen them. Gather the data. This is the actual benchmarking process when you acquire data. Then you analyze the data. This is like the debriefing that takes place after you've collected the data, after you had your interviews and the questionnaires are filled out. You come back and you take a look at your data itself, and you integrate the results into actions. And these are action plans. They are like going to take you in the system so that you can fill up this gap, you can meet this gap. Then of course you recalibrate and recycle the process, which is the Motorola way. Their culture is they never stop. They'll go up and up and up. They are spiraling up. If you remember the Motorola story, the Six Sigma Motorola story, they started with pretty poor level of quality. And the Japanese wireless sets, they had much better performance. And Motorola lost its market share from being something like 90% plus to something that became 10%. That was their the time when they woke up suddenly. And then of course they've been mocking this Six Sigma path, and we've heard the story and so on and so forth. There are many people, of course, people like General Electric and so on, they picked it up from Motorola, and of course they have also done wonders with the Six Sigma approach. AT&T uses a somewhat more elaborate approach, but let's try to see, are they doing something that is radically different? Perhaps they've split up something that was combined into one step in the other situation, the previous company's situation. Identify what to bottleneck. Okay, this is something we've heard before. They have a separate distinct step called develop a benchmarking plan. They're pretty heavy on planning. Choose a data collection method. That also is something that is being done. So step 2 and 3, these are basically preparation steps. Step number 4 is collect the data. This is where you're really doing benchmarking. Then of course we've got choose the best in class companies. I believe this is really done. The collection of data is perhaps their own data. Collection of data in step 4 is their own data. Step 5 is when they choose the best in class companies, they are going to be collecting data from there, and that is done in step 6. They collect that data in a site visit. Then they compare the processes, identify the gaps. Notice now, finally we hear this word gap, and develop recommendations. These are the ways by which we would like to narrow the gap. And of course then they implement the recommendations and recalibrate the benchmarks. That actually means now I'm already there, perhaps I need a higher level of benchmark to get up there. This is the 9th step. So what is distinct about this one? Well, it turns out they have a planning method that is somewhat new, and they have very clear steps where they collect their own data, then they collect the data from the benchmarker. That's like something we've done in this case. They compare processes, identify gaps, and develop recommendation. That also is a formal step. So it's not buried into a whole layer of different type of activities. They put it right up there, so we can see very clearly that they respect it pretty highly. This is a generic model. What is a generic model? This is some model, this is an approach that will apply across the board. No matter what process you're looking at, you could probably apply, if you applied this process, you still would be able to do benchmarking, half decently. It's not going to be as thorough as the Motorola method or the AT&T method, but still it will be a pretty decent method. I'll show you a few examples of who are the best in town people and who are the globally best people, and what are why they are thought to be that way. So there are benchmark companies that are respected worldwide as leaders in their own areas of operation. I'm going to give you some examples of them. Now, what is this simple, call it watered down way, quick and dirty of doing benchmarking? launch the plan, launch the project, organize, reach out, assimilate, and act. Notice these things we've been doing. We launched out, that means we understood, we've understood the requirement, and therefore we understood that there is a need for us to change. We organized, so in that process we located a company outside. We located a company that we could benchmark against. We established the communication. We conveyed to them that we'd like to come and visit you. Then we went out. We really did the reaching out and we collected data there. That's something that we did. Then we did the assimilation, which is like we got back the data, we did the debriefing, and we compared the performance that we observed and the performance that we have ourselves. We compared that, and that will be the assimilation. In that process, we also generated ideas to perhaps take some action on our part, and then we acted. If you do this, you're still doing benchmarking. You're probably not doing it as thoroughly as the other one. But, half of the practices on the shop floor, they are sort of like this. So this is still all right. You're following a particular order. That's what you're doing there. Xerox uses a 12-step process. I should just tell you, before I go deep into this, Xerox is thought to be the company that is top-notch in benchmarking. So if you're trying to benchmark, you have to find out how does Xerox benchmark. Xerox is a company whose benchmark practices themselves are benchmarks. I hope you understood what I said. They have a certain way to do benchmarking, and that way itself is a benchmark in industry. So their benchmarking process itself is a benchmark for other people to follow. What is their process? Let's take a look at this. They have this clear step called planning. Identify what to benchmark. That's step number 1 of the 12 steps that they follow. Identify comparative companies. So this is like when I'm looking out and I'm trying to find out who else is doing the same sort of thing. Determine the data collection method and then collect data. This is how I'm doing now. I've identified these two guys. I've found out what is it that I'd like to benchmark with, and I've got some identification done. So I've located a company that I'd like to do benchmarking with. And I've done my data collection method establishment, and I've collected some data. Then of course I locate this current performance gap. Again, the word gap comes in. That's a very important word there. Project future performance levels. So this is where I'm trying to now shoot a target for, set a target for myself. So if I'm at 4 sigma level and my benchmark company is 5.5, I may set a target of 5, for example, 5 sigma level of quality. That's like a certain parts per billion level. That's something that I'd like to be able to do. So I have actually now set a projected target for my own performance. Communicate the findings and gain acceptance. Now this has to be done internally. Once I've returned with my benchmarking data, the information and the notes and so on and so forth, I've got to communicate that within my own company. I've got to make sure that people appreciate that. I've got to, of course, come up with the incentives. Why am I doing this? There is an example, and I'd like to bring up this example. That example comes from cost of quality. That's like another item where you could really do a performance measurement and you could really find out what kind of warranty service does this company have. If it turns out that Toyota has very little warranty service and there's another local auto car maker and they have a lot of warranty services, something is, of course, that wide gap is there, and they've got to do something about that gap that is there. So this is where it's very, very important for us to make sure we establish the reasons why we have to change, why we have to have this thing there. So we've got to establish this, what we call the incentives. That's very important. Unless you do that, the motivation won't be there for people to change. They'll just say, well, things are going fine, we are selling cars and so on. Who cares what it costs me? So again, you come back to cost of quality. And what are those components of quality? You got external failures. These are cars that break down when the customer is driving it on the road, for example, or he has a trouble after he purchased the car. That's an external failure. Internal failure. While I'm producing the car, I have a lot of scrap, a lot of this, a lot of that, a lot of rework. That's internal failure. Then I've got a lot of inspection going. typically you go to an auto industry, you'll find a lot of inspections, a lot of inspectors there. So that's also something that costs you money. But the thing that can reduce all of these things, this is like the large cost of quality that you'd like to avoid altogether, is the preventive actions. And your preventive actions would involve, for example, SPC, 7 tools training, and a whole lot of quality assurance methods, and so on and so forth. And these are the ones that are required to reduce your total cost of quality. In fact, the Japanese showed that economically it is justifiable to try to reach zero defect. Economically it is justifiable. Not that it costs you more money overall to basically reach that perfection, that level of perfection. You do save money overall. That's like something, because there are fewer warranties, fewer rework, fewer scrap, and so on and so forth. You end up saving money. You save so much money that you actually have a positive return on the effort that you're putting in. If this positive return would not be there, no Six Sigma project would be done anywhere in the world, because every Six Sigma project must justify its existence. And that is done by figuring out what are going to be the returns of the preventive step where I'm spending some money and some resources. Benchmarking turns out to be the, is the tool that is used in the A step to try to make sure that you've understood the gap that is there, so that you get the incentives for trying to complete that gap. The other steps that are there, communicate the findings and gains, and establish, of course, functional goals. These are very important so that people will have something to do. The other steps that Xerox follows are develop action plans. Now, this is the follow-up from benchmarking. Implement specific actions and monitor the progress. Recalibrate the benchmarks. So far, so good. This is exactly what the other people have been doing. But Xerox goes a little bit further. Attain leadership position. Reach that level of global perfection. Leader in the global sense. And fully integrated practices. Now you've got better practices, make sure they get into your system completely. End to end, you've got perfection. Some things can lead to failures, and some things can lead you to success with benchmarking. First, let's talk about failures. Sponsorship is uncertain. That means you do not know which manager is supporting it. Amorphous objectives. Objectives are not clear. Why did you start this project? No strategic integration. They've got a lot of other initiatives in the company, and the benchmarking has not been integrated with those. That's like another big problem. If it is there, of course, your project is doomed. You are only using performance matrices, which are your conventional matrices, and you're only using hard data, that's all. Arbitrary casual approaches used, incremental, no real change. Keep going and going and going, so it becomes like a non-stop project. And it's an a la carte program. That means there are like a few steps laid out, and you basically just follow the steps. If you do your benchmarking this way, you're not going to be successful. Look at the aspect that would make you really excel in this area. Process owner involvement, which is like there is a process owner. There's a champion who says, I want my process to be improved. And therefore, kindly go ahead and do what it takes to benchmark this process. Customer-driven objectives instead of vague objectives. Link to strategic plan. This is the corporate strategic plan that is there for the company. You link benchmarking to that. Best practices and the best tools for you to use when you're doing this. Consider cultural attributes. This is like something that also I've got to incorporate in addition to having hard data only to sell the project. Discipline methodology instead of doing it ad hoc. Quantum change. We should really look for breakthrough. Without this breakthrough, of course, little improvement here and there, that's not really benchmarking. That's not really a successful benchmarking sort of thing. This is something we got to be able to do. Clear project life cycle. So we got to stop it also at a certain point in time. And it's got to be integrated with my existing quality effort. That also has to be there. Unless this is there, our project is not going to be successful. A balanced scorecard, you might be aware of this, that today companies, they are measuring their success from something that is besides the financial perspective. They now look at the customer's view, they look at internal operating view, They look at learning perspectives. These are the different perspectives that have been drawn into running the company successfully. And many of these, the readings or the reports from the Balanced Scorecard, these can also lead to benchmarking, because you would again look at the same sort of attribute in another company and say that how much time are they spending on this, how much money they are making there, what are the different projects they worked on, and so forth. If you start doing those comparisons, you will also have an agenda for doing benchmarking. There are certain common performance measures. These are, again, I'm going to be listing them for you, and please take a look at later on as you wish. And you've got to make sure you justify benchmarking. This is something that's got to be done before you get into a project like this. It's very important. There are examples of benchmark processes, and IBM gives you a whole lot of examples, whole lot of steps where IBM can provide benchmarks. Xerox, there are various steps where Xerox can provide you with benchmarks. And British Telecom, there are a number of processes where they can also provide you with benchmarks. This is something that's got to be done. And once you've done that, you got some challenge for your management. For example, when management is looking at benchmarking, they got to be able to commit resources. They should provide the time for training. They should proactively manage the direction, the momentum benchmarking. That is something they got to be able to do. They should create visibility for anything that succeeds with benchmarking. That's something they got to be able to do. And also they should recognize and reward people who are succeeding with benchmarking. That means they're identifying these gaps, and they're also generating the incentive for the company to change from that state here, which is not so good, to a state that is higher than that. It is the identification of this gap plus the effort required to get there. If you do that, you're making full use of this technique called benchmarking, which is also a method like your design of experiments. This also gets into your improvement. You're doing most of your benchmarking at the analysis phase in DMAT. Thank you very much.